You know, usually when we talk about making a diagnosis, whether that's medical or mechanical, even historical, there's this baseline expectation of precision.
Right, like finding the exact problem.
Exactly. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
Yeah.
The problem is visible, it's categorized, and honestly, that clarity is pretty comforting. But, step into the world of geopolitics, historical narratives, and theology on a day like today, Monday, March 16th, 2026, and that x-ray machine just shatters completely.
It really does.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is not just murky, it's actively fighting against a single interpretation.
Because the lens you have to apply here is entirely different.
Yeah.
You really can't approach this material looking for a simple binary truth.
No, definitely not.
We're examining a highly charged, deeply theological and extensively historical polemic today. This is a text written from a very distinct Islamic and Arab perspective.
Right.
And its entire stated purpose is to systematically deconstruct and refute the foundational claims of Judaism and modern Zionism. It is an exercise in total narrative demolition.
Which means we need to set a crucial ground rule for you, our listener, before we go a single step further.
Yes, very important.
You are going to hear some heavily political, religiously charged, and frankly polemical viewpoints today. Our job in this deep dive is strictly to map out and understand the architecture of the arguments the author is making.
We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. We are absolutely not taking sides, nor are we endorsing these viewpoints. We're not here to, validate or invalidate the historical trauma or the political claims of any group.
Right.
Our goal is simply to put this specific text under a microscope so you can see exactly how this narrative engine is built, how it operates, and, what it intends to achieve.
And understanding that architecture is, it's non-negotiable if you want to comprehend the reality of the Middle East. You can't just look at a map of borders drawn in 1948 or 1967 and grasp the conflict.
It goes way deeper than lines on a map.
Way deeper. You have to understand how the actors view history itself, how they view theology, and critically, how they define the very nature of their adversaries.
Yeah.
What we have in our source material today is basically a masterclass in this kind of foundational deconstruction. The author isn't just saying, I disagree with my opponent's geopolitical policies. They're attempting to pull up the bedrock of the opponent's entire reason for existing on a specific piece of land.
It's like injecting a piece of malicious code into an opponent's operating system.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. The author isn't merely attacking from the outside. They are attempting to use the opponent's own history, their own biology, and their own sacred texts to make the entire system crash from within.
Yeah, the inside-out approach.
And the way they execute this is by targeting what they identify as 3 foundational myths. So that's the concept of the chosen people, the idea of a pure, unbroken genetic race, and finally the claim to historical and religious rights to the land itself.
But, before the author can even begin to dismantle those 3 pillars, they have to lay a foundation of their own.
Okay, where do they start?
They have to establish a reason why you, the reader, should fundamentally distrust everything the opponent says. So the source text opens with a sweeping theological and historical accusation.
Which is?
That the Jewish people, specifically their leadership and modern Zionists, are fundamentally characterized by lying and fabrication.
Wow. And we aren't talking about everyday political spin here.
No, not at all. The text goes as far as accusing them of lying against God.
That is a massive escalation.
It is an accusation of cosmic forgery, really.
Right.
And to build this premise, the author leans heavily on Islamic scripture, citing specific Quranic verses to establish this inherent deceptiveness as a theological fact.
Okay, so they're anchoring this in their own holy text first.
Exactly. The primary anchor here is Surah al-Baqarah, verse 79. This is a very powerful verse in Islamic theology. It condemns those who write the scripture with their own hands and then falsely claim this is from God.
Wait, so they write it themselves and pass it off as divine?
Right, and the verse says they do it in order to exchange it for a miserable price, or basically a minor worldly gain.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let me make sure I'm grasping the scale of this argument.
Yeah, it's big.
The author is using this Quranic foundation to assert that the very texts the opponent relies upon, like the Torah, the biblical narratives, are essentially political fabrications masquerading as divine revelation.
That is exactly the claim.
Because if you successfully convince a jury that the foundational texts are forged, you have essentially poisoned the well.
Precisely.
It's like an incredibly aggressive courtroom tactic. You start your opening statement by trying to prove the opposing star witness is a pathological liar.
Right, so that no matter what documents they produce later, the jury is already compromised in their reception of that evidence.
They won't believe a word of it.
The rhetorical strategy is exactly that. You discredit the origin, so you never actually have to engage with the evidence on equal footing.
That makes sense.
If a group is willing to forge the word of the creator for political leverage or financial gain, the logical implication the author pushes is, what wouldn't they lie about?
They're setting up a paradigm of deliberate obfuscation.
Exactly. But the author doesn't just rely on abstract scriptural verses to make this point.
Oh, they have examples.
Yeah, they bring in a very specific, character-driven narrative to illustrate this supposed inherent deceptiveness.
Okay, what's the story?
It's the story of Abdullah bin Salam.
Let me guess, this doesn't end well for his reputation in the text.
Well, it's fascinating. This narrative, which is cited in the text and narrated by Anas bin Malik, is utilized as a crucial piece of historical and psychological evidence.
Okay.
So Abdullah bin Salam was a prominent, highly respected Jewish leader in Medina during the time of the Prophet Muhammad.
Got it.
According to the text, Abdullah secretly converts to Islam. But he understands the social dynamics of his community intimately.
Right, he knows how they operate.
Exactly. So before making his conversion public, he approaches the Prophet and suggests a blind test of character.
A blind test.
Yeah. He essentially says, "My people are prone to slander. Before they know my new allegiance, bring them in and ask them what they think of me."
Oh, wow. It's a brilliant psychological setup.
It really is.
So the Prophet brings in the Jewish leaders of Medina and asks for their honest assessment of Abdullah bin Salam.
And they give him a glowing, totally unblemished performance review.
Of course they do.
They say, "He is our best, the son of our best. He is our master and our most knowledgeable." They elevate his character to the absolute highest tier of their society.
So the trap is perfectly laid.
The moment their praise is on the record, Abdullah steps out from his hiding place, reveals his presence, and declares his conversion to Islam.
And let me guess, the leaders backtrack.
According to the narrative, they pivot instantly. Without a single moment of hesitation, they completely reverse their assessment.
Just like that.
Just like that. They begin shouting, "He is the worst among us, the son of the worst." And they proceed to tear down the very reputation they had just fiercely defended seconds prior.
That is wild.
And Abdullah then turns to the Prophet and basically says, "See? This is exactly what I was afraid of."
I mean, the narrative whiplash there is the entire point.
Exactly.
The author isn't including this story just to give us an interesting historical anecdote from centuries ago. They're using it as a diagnostic tool.
Yes, a way to diagnose the opponent.
The author is arguing that this isn't an isolated incident, but rather a demonstration of a cultural or inherent mechanism of deceit.
A willingness to completely fabricate reality on a dime to suit a political or social agenda.
And the text brings this to the present day, right?
Yeah, the author explicitly draws a line from that ancient incident in Medina straight to the modern geopolitical stage.
So they're saying Zionists do this now.
The claim is that this exact same mechanism of fabrication is currently being deployed by modern Zionists to deceive global public opinion,
Particularly in the West.
especially in the West. By anchoring the premise of fabrication with both theology and a historical anecdote, the author basically gives themselves the structural permission to systematically attack the opponent's core identity.
Which brings us to the first massive pillar the author attempts to demolish. Because if the foundational texts are indeed forged, as the author claims, then the identity built upon those texts is suddenly incredibly vulnerable.
Absolutely.
So the author targets the concept of the chosen people.
And this is where the debate moves from the mechanics of truth-telling into incredibly granular theology.
Okay, take us into the weeds.
The author attacks the deeply held claim that Jews are the children of God and his chosen people. And to do this effectively, the author first has to accurately frame the opponent's position using their own traditions.
Right, you have to define what you're attacking. So the text points directly to the Torah, which, we should note, it consistently refers to as altered or corrupted. But it cites passages that declare, "You are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a special people to himself above all peoples on the face of the earth."
And the author also pulls from the Mishnah, quoting Rabbi Akiva, who asserts that the children of Israel are beloved specifically because they are called the children of God.
But the author isn't just taking issue with the spiritual idea, right? They're focused on the real-world impact.
Exactly. The author is highly focused on the sociological fallout of this specific theology. The argument is that this belief in being the eternal people or God's uniquely beloved does not just stay in the realm of private spirituality.
It leaks out into how they view everyone else.
Right, it inevitably metastasizes into an extreme sense of worldly superiority. The text argues that this theology inherently creates an us versus them dichotomy.
And they bring up specific terminology to prove that, don't they?
Yes, they bring up the use of terms like goyim to illustrate how this worldview inherently categorizes everyone outside the group as lesser or fundamentally different in their standing before the Creator.
But dismantling a deeply held religious belief requires more than just pointing out its social consequences.
You can't just say it's mean.
Exactly. You cannot argue someone out of their spiritual identity just by saying it's unfair. You have to trap them in their own logic.
Which is where the text brings in a truly fascinating counter-argument.
Using the Quran, right.
Using Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 18 from the Quran. This is perhaps the most intellectually rigorous theological argument in the entire first section.
I love this part. Break it down for us.
So the Quran directly addresses the claim of being God's children and beloved. To unpack the philosophical weight of this, the text cites the commentary of Imam Qurtubi.
He's a highly influential classical Islamic scholar.
Very influential.
Yeah.
And Al-Qurtubi constructs what is essentially an inescapable Aristotelian trap.
Let's walk through the mechanics of Al-Qurtubi's logic, because it is brilliant in its simplicity.
It really is.
Al-Qurtubi says, if you claim to be God's unconditionally beloved children, then why does he punish you for your sins?
That's the core question.
The foundational premise is that a lover does not violently punish their beloved. So the opponent is forced into a paradox.
And the paradox demands a choice, and both options are devastating to their claim.
Okay, what's option one?
Option one. You admit that God does indeed punish you.
Which empirically proves you are not his specially insulated, unconditionally beloved children who are immune to his wrath.
Exactly. It means you are subject to the same divine justice as everyone else.
Okay, and option two?
Option two. You claim he does not punish you. But to claim that, you have to deny the very text of your own sacred scriptures.
Because their scriptures are filled with instances of divine retribution, plagues, exiles, and destruction.
Right. And you also have to deny the tangible reality of your own traumatic history.
Wow. You cannot simultaneously claim unique, unconditional divine favoritism while holding a historical record characterized by profound divine retribution.
It's a logical impossibility.
It's a checkmate.
Yeah.
And having sprung that trap, the author then pivots to present the Islamic counter-narrative, which offers a radically different view of human standing before God.
Yes. The Islamic paradigm presented in the text is one of absolute foundational egalitarianism.
Everyone is equal.
The argument asserts that all human beings are fundamentally equal because they share the exact same biological and spiritual origin. Adam, who was created from dust.
So there is no such thing as inherent genetic or ancestral superiority in this worldview.
None. It is a complete rejection of biological essentialism in religion. The only metric of superiority, according to this text, is piety and righteous action.
It's an absolute meritocracy of faith.
Exactly. You are not born chosen. You choose to be righteous through your actions.
And anyone from any lineage has the exact same access to that divine favor.
Right. And to drive this point into the realm of psychology, the author highlights a specific, highly provocative challenge laid out in the Quran.
This is the wish for death challenge, isn't it?
Yes, often referred to as the wish for death challenge.
Imagine the psychological pressure of this.
It's intense.
The Quran essentially issues a direct dare to the Jewish community of that era, stating, if you truly believe that the afterlife is exclusively yours, that paradise is guaranteed for you and no one else to the exclusion of all other people, then you should logically wish for death.
And the logic is totally sound. I mean, if you are absolutely certain of your elite, chosen status, and you possess a guaranteed VIP ticket to eternal bliss.
Why would you stay here?
Exactly. Why would you cling so desperately to this flawed, painful, and temporary earthly existence? Death should be a welcome transition, like a rapid boarding pass to your guaranteed reward.
But the challenge immediately follows up with a psychological read.
It does.
The Quran asserts that they will never ever wish for death, specifically because of the deeds their own hands have committed.
The argument is that deep down, beneath the theological claims of purity, there is a profound awareness of their own transgressions.
They cling to life because they actually fear the reality of divine judgment.
It is a devastating psychological critique embedded within a theological debate. But what's fascinating here is that the author's most potent weapon in dismantling the chosen people myth isn't actually the Quran.
No, it's not. It's the opponent's own sacred texts.
The sheer volume of biblical evidence the author marshals against them is staggering.
It's a classic, highly aggressive polemical technique. The author moves past saying, "My holy book says your holy book is wrong," and upgrades to "your own holy book says you are wrong."
Exactly. First, the text lists the Islamic indictments. So that's 11 specific instances in the Quran where they are cursed.
Like being punished by being turned into apes and swine for violating the Sabbath.
Right, or being cursed for making arrogant claims about God's power. But then, the author opens the Bible.
And they go straight for the top.
They begin with the ultimate authority figure in Judaism, Moses. The author quotes Moses from the Torah, predicting the inevitable catastrophic corruption of his own people.
What does he say?
Moses is essentially quoted as saying, "I know how rebellious and stiff-necked you are. If you have been this disobedient and prone to rebellion while I am alive and leading you, how much worse will you be after I die?"
That's rough.
And he finishes with, "I know for a certainty that you will become utterly corrupt and turn away from the path I have commanded you."
The founder of the law is literally called as the first hostile witness against them.
And then the author moves chronologically through the biblical timeline to the Psalms.
Oh, the quote from the Psalms used in the text is absolutely brutal.
It really is.
It's a lamentation detailing how they worshipped the idol Baal Peor, how they mingled with the surrounding nations and adopted their pagan practices, and this is the worst part, most horrifyingly, how they sacrificed their own sons and daughters to Canaanite idols.
And the text notes that they polluted the land with blood, and consequently the anger of the Lord burned violently against his own inheritance, and he handed them over to the power of the nations.
The unbroken chain of self-incrimination just continues into the era of the major prophets, right?
It does. The author brings in Jeremiah, quoting his lamentations that because of the sheer magnitude of their sins and their refusal to repent, God clothed himself in wrath, refused to pardon them, and ultimately drove them into brutal exile.
And they don't even stop at the Old Testament. The author pulls from the Christian Gospels, utilizing the words of Jesus.
Yes, the text highlights Jesus mourning over the city of Jerusalem, explicitly labeling it the killer of prophets and the one who stones those sent to it.
And Jesus concludes with that devastating decree, "Look, your house is left to you desolate."
Step back and analyze the architecture of this specific argument.
It's methodical.
Very. The author is taking the entire spiritual timeline of the opponent, from Moses in the desert to David in the Psalms to Jeremiah during the Babylonian exile, all the way to Jesus in the first century.
And stringing together every single moment of divine rebuke, every failure, every catastrophic punishment.
They are weaponizing the sacred history against the people who revere it.
But hold on, we have to address a massive logical paradox here.
Okay, what's that?
The author spent the entire first section of this polemic painstakingly arguing that the Torah and the biblical scriptures are entirely corrupted, altered, fabricated texts that cannot be trusted as divine truth.
Yeah.
Yet here in the second section, they are quoting these exact same texts extensively and treating them as undeniable, authoritative proof of divine punishment.
It's true.
How does the author reconcile using a forged document as star evidence?
Well, it is a highly calculated, almost cynical rhetorical maneuver. The author is actually leaning into the paradox.
How so?
The implied argument is essentially this. Even in your heavily corrupted, self-serving, altered version of the text, the reality of your guilt was so overwhelming that you couldn't completely erase it.
Oh, wow.
The implication is that the truth of their continuous rebellion is so undeniably foundational to their historical record that even the fabricators who rewrote the rest of the text were forced to leave these massive indictments in place.
It turns the opponent's own sacred history into an inescapable confession.
Exactly.
That is a staggering intellectual trap. You dismantle their theology, turn their own prophets against them, and frame their scriptures as a botched cover-up.
It's narrative warfare.
It really is. And having attempted to obliterate the theological claim of being the chosen people, the author executes a hard pivot.
Right into science.
Exactly. We move entirely out of the realm of theology and scripture and plunge directly into anthropology, genetics, and demographics. The author now targets myth 2. The claim of a pure Jewish race.
This is where the deep dive takes a radical detour into the mechanics of identity.
Yeah.
The author targets a specific foundational claim of modern Zionism, quoting Theodor Herzl.
Who is widely considered the father of modern political Zionism.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Herzl is quoted as asserting that the Jews have remained one people, a distinct and unbroken race, and that their unique nationality cannot and must not be allowed to perish.
Which serves as the primary justification for the necessity of a Jewish state.
The Zionist claim, as the author frames it, relies heavily on biological continuity.
It's the idea that modern Jews are a single, pure, unbroken genetic lineage descending directly generation by generation from the ancient patriarchs Isaac and Jacob.
And the author attacks this biological essentialism on two distinct fronts.
Let's hear the first one.
The first front is historical, and once again relies on the opponent's own ancient records.
Of course.
The author points out that from the very inception of their history in the Levant, the ancient Israelites were never a genetically isolated group.
Because the biblical texts themselves record that they settled among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites.
Exactly. They engaged in extensive intermarriage. They gave their daughters to the surrounding tribes and took their daughters for themselves.
So, the idea of ancient, pristine genetic isolation is dismantled right out of the gate by their own history.
Right. But the second front of the attack, however, relies on modern science.
Anthropological data.
Yes. The text brings in anthropology to argue against the existence of a biological Jewish identity. The author quotes a Swiss anthropologist named Eugene Pittard to provide academic weight to this deconstruction.
And Pittard's anthropological argument is critical to the author's strategy.
Very critical. Pittard asserts that from a strictly scientific, biological, and morphological standpoint, there is absolutely no such thing as a Jewish race.
Nor is there a single unifying Jewish physical appearance.
Right. Pittard argues that Judaism is and has always been a religious and social construct that has absorbed incredibly diverse ethnic backgrounds over millennia of migration and proselytization.
I mean, you look at the global Jewish population, and the ethnic diversity is just staggering.
It is.
You have the Falashas of Ethiopia, who are genetically and phenotypically African. You have the Ashkenazim in Europe, who share the genetic markers of Germanic and Slavic populations.
And you have the Tamil Jews in India, who are racially distinct from both the Ashkenazim and the Falashas.
Right. So Pittard's point is that you cannot put these diverse populations into a laboratory and extract a single unifying biological or anatomical characteristic that binds them all as a single race.
Biologically speaking, they are representative of the myriad global populations they have lived among and intermarried with for centuries.
Not a single ancient Middle Eastern tribe frozen in genetic amber.
Exactly. Which makes complete logical sense if you view Judaism strictly as a religion that has accepted converts throughout its long history.
Right, but the author doesn't stop at anthropology.
No, they take it a huge step further.
Here's where it gets really interesting for our listener. They take Pittard's premise that modern Jews are a mix of converts and swing for the fences with a specific, highly controversial historical hypothesis.
The Khazar hypothesis.
Yes, the Khazars. And this is designed to completely sever the ancestral link between modern European Jews and the ancient land of Palestine.
The Khazar argument is perhaps the most audacious historical weapon deployed in the entire text.
We need to unpack this.
To understand its impact, we really have to set the geopolitical stage of the 8th century.
Okay, take us there.
According to the source text, which heavily cites the 1903 Jewish Encyclopedia to validate its claims, the Khazars were a powerful, semi-nomadic Turkic people.
Paint the picture for us. Where exactly are we on the map? Because we aren't in the Middle East anymore.
We are entirely removed from the Middle East. We are in the Eurasian steppe in southern Russia.
Southern Russia.
Okay, the Khazar Khaganate was a massive empire primarily situated in the Caucasus region. It stretched between the Volga and Don rivers.
And they had a capital city.
Yes, a thriving capital called Itil, located near the delta of the Volga River, where it meets the Caspian Sea.
So we are talking about a superpower in Eastern Europe.
A major superpower. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the Khazar Empire was incredibly strategic and wealthy. They basically controlled the major trade routes along the Silk Road.
Wow, okay.
But geopolitically, they were sandwiched between two expanding, religiously zealous empires.
Who were they?
The Islamic Caliphate pushing up from the south, and the Christian Byzantine Empire pushing from the west.
Both of whom would love to absorb the Khazars into their spheres of influence.
Exactly. And according to the historical narrative presented in our text, the Khazar leadership made a brilliant, calculated geopolitical move.
Let me guess. They didn't pick a side.
Right. Rather than converting to Islam and alienating the Byzantines or converting to Christianity and provoking the caliphate, somewhere around the 8th or 9th century, the Khazar royalty, the nobility, and eventually a vast portion of the general populace converted to Judaism en masse.
Oh, wow. It was a way to maintain absolute political neutrality and independence while upgrading from paganism to a recognized monotheistic faith.
It was a genius move. And the text quotes the 1903 Jewish Encyclopedia, stating that by the 9th century, it appeared that the entirety of the Khazar population had become Jews.
They became a massive, powerful, and entirely Turkic Jewish empire in the heart of Eastern Europe.
Yes, and this empire flourished for a couple of centuries, before it eventually weakened and fell to the expanding Kievan Rus.
The Kievan Rus.
Yeah, the ancestors of modern Russians and Ukrainians. That happened sometime around the 10th and 11th centuries.
Okay, so a massive Turkic empire converts to Judaism, rules for a few hundred years, and then the empire collapses under the weight of the Kievan Rus. What does the author say happens to millions of Khazar Jews when their state disappears?
Well, the author claims they didn't just vanish into the steppe.
Right, people have to go somewhere.
When the Khazar Empire collapsed, these populations migrated westward into Eastern and Central Europe, flooding into regions that would become Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Germany.
Okay, I see where this is going.
And the author makes a definitive, aggressive assertion. These descendants of the Turkic Khazars are the direct ancestors of the Ashkenazi Jews.
We need to pause and clarify why this specific demographic detail is so critical.
It's the linchpin of the argument.
Because the Ashkenazim make up the vast majority of the global Jewish population today.
Yes.
Furthermore, as the text explicitly points out, it is the Ashkenazim who historically formed the political, military, and social ruling class that envisioned and established the modern state of Israel.
This is the absolute crux of the author's genetic argument. The author states, citing demographic interpretations, that over 92% of all people who identify as Jews in the modern world are actually descendants of these Asian Khazars.
92%. That is an astronomically high statistic to throw into a geopolitical debate.
It is massive.
Let's really analyze the so what of this argument. What does it fundamentally mean for the conflict if the author's 92% Khazar claim is taken as absolute truth?
If 92% of modern Jews are descendants of a Turkic tribe from the Volga River who converted to Judaism in the 8th century, it means their ancestors never, ever set foot in the Holy Land during the Old Testament era.
Right.
They have absolutely zero genetic, biological, or historical connection to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, or the ancient kingdoms of Israel and Judah.
It completely vaporizes the concept of return.
Entirely.
I mean, the entire moral and historical justification for the modern state of Israel, the narrative that has captured the imagination of the West, relies on the deeply emotional idea that an indigenous people, brutally exiled from their ancestral homeland by the Romans 2,000 years ago, are finally returning to the exact soil of their forefathers.
But the author is utilizing the Khazar hypothesis to say, you cannot return to a place your ancestors never lived.
It is a devastating attempt to invalidate indigenous status.
The text argues that if this population truly wants to claim a historical homeland based on ancestral rights and genetics, they shouldn't be looking at the Levant.
Where should they look?
They should be petitioning for a homeland in southern Russia, near the Volga River, where the Khazar capital of Ityl actually existed.
This is narrative warfare executed at the cellular level.
It really is.
This is not a debate over whether the borders should be drawn along the 1967 lines or whether a specific settlement is legal under international law. This is an attempt to invalidate the biological reality of the people themselves.
It aims to entirely strip away the aura of historical inevitability from the state's existence by severing the genetic link to the ancient Israelites.
And notice the methodology again.
Yes, the academic sourcing.
By relying heavily on the 1903 Jewish Encyclopedia and Western European anthropologists like Eugene Pittard to construct this demolition, the author is once again trying to use the opponent's own academic and historical institutions to dismantle their identity.
Which logically and methodically sets the stage for the final section of our text.
This is part 4 of the deconstruction.
Exactly. Yeah. The author has attacked the theological claim of being the chosen people. They have attacked the genetic claim of racial purity using anthropology and the Khazars.
And now?
Now, they target the final physical pillar, the claim that the Jewish people have a historical and religious right to the physical land of Palestine.
This is where the abstract concepts of theology and genetics finally hit the dirt.
Right.
The Jewish claim to the land, as outlined and targeted in the text, rests on two massive foundations: a claim of ancient ancestral residence and a claim of an eternal divine promise made by God to Abraham, granting him the land from the Nile to the Euphrates.
And the author systematically tackles the historical arguments first, deploying a highly specific timeline to challenge the idea of primary ownership.
Okay, what's their historical timeline look like?
First, the author asserts that Arab tribes, specifically identifying ancient groups like the Canaanites and the Phoenicians as Arab, were living, building, and thriving in Palestine thousands of years before the first wandering Israelites ever arrived from Egypt or Mesopotamia.
So the argument is about who holds the original deed.
Exactly. Who was there first? But the author goes further, asserting that these indigenous Arab populations never actually left.
What do you mean?
Well, despite empires rising and falling, Babylonians, Romans, Crusaders, Ottomans, the foundational demographic presence of these Arab populations has been continuous and unbroken right up to the modern Palestinian people.
Okay, and then they tie this back to the Khazar argument.
Yes, second, the author naturally brings the Khazar hypothesis back into the fray. They reiterate that because the overwhelming majority of modern Jews are legally and biologically Khazars, they have zero historical claim to Palestine, regardless of who lived there anciently.
Right, because their only historical claim lies in the depths of Russia.
Exactly. And third, the author looks at the actual duration of the ancient Israelite kingdoms to make a quantitative argument.
A quantitative argument, like doing the math on the years.
Yeah. Even if we completely accept the biblical history at face value, the conquests of Joshua, the united monarchy of David and Solomon, the divided kingdoms, the text calculates that the ancient Israelite sovereign presence in Palestine only lasted somewhere between 3.5 to 5 centuries.
In the grand sweep of Middle Eastern history, the author frames 500 years as a mere historical blip.
It is a drop in the bucket compared to millennia of continuous, uninterrupted Arab presence.
The author is essentially asking, does a 500-year occupation 2,500 years ago grant eternal real estate rights that override the rights of the people who've lived there continuously for 4,000 years?
It is a powerful quantitative argument against historical ownership. But as we know, in this region, history is always subjugated to theology.
Always.
The religious argument, the divine promise to Abraham, is where the real heavy lifting happens.
How does the author go about severing the link between modern Jews and the eternal promise given to the patriarch of monotheism?
They execute this by basically redefining Abraham himself.
Redefining Abraham.
Yeah. They start by quoting the Quran, which states explicitly and emphatically that Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian.
Okay.
Rather, he was a Hanif, a pure monotheist, and a Muslim, meaning one who fundamentally submits to the will of God. The Quran explicitly notes he was not an idolater.
This theological framing serves to instantly sever the exclusive religious monopoly the opponent claims over the patriarch.
Exactly. If Abraham wasn't a Jew, then his covenant cannot be exclusively Jewish.
Right.
But then the author does something truly brilliant, returning to that tactic of weaponizing the opponent's own text.
Back to the Bible.
Yes. They use the book of Genesis to make a highly specific timeline-based legal argument about the nature of divine inheritance.
This is a fascinating piece of scriptural forensics.
It really is. The author treats the book of Genesis like a contested legal will and testament, looking at the precise chronology of when God's promises to Abraham were made, reiterated, and sealed.
Let's act like forensic accountants here and walk through this Genesis timeline step by step, because the logic is intricate.
Okay, let's do it. According to the source text analysis, the sequence unfolds like this. First, God promises the land to Abraham when he initially arrives in the land of Canaan from Haran.
Which is recorded in Genesis 12.
Right. And at this specific point in the timeline, Abraham has absolutely no children.
Okay, so the initial promise is made to a childless man.
Correct. The promise is then reiterated after Abraham returns from his sojourn in Egypt. This is Genesis 13.
And he is still completely childless.
Right. It is reiterated a third time in a profound visionary covenant in Genesis 15. Abraham is distressed because his heir is a servant, Eliezer of Damascus. God promises him a biological heir.
But at this moment, he is still childless.
Yes. So the promise is firmly established, but the biological beneficiary does not yet exist.
Okay, so what happens next?
Then the critical biological event occurs. Abraham, through Hagar, has his first son, Ishmael.
Right.
After Ishmael is born and has grown for over a decade, the promise of the land is reiterated yet again, this time sealed as an eternal covenant with the rite of circumcision. This is Genesis 17.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the exact legal logic the author is deploying here.
Okay.
At the moment, Genesis 17 occurs, sealing the eternal covenant. The only existing heir, the only son of Abraham walking the earth, is Ishmael.
Exactly.
Isaac has not even been conceived yet.
That is exactly the author's point. The author argues that based purely on the strict chronology of the Torah itself, the divine promise of the land was formalized and sealed when Ishmael was the sole undisputed heir.
So therefore, if there is a divine inheritance of real estate based on biological lineage, it logically and legally belongs to the firstborn, Ishmael.
And in the theological framework we are discussing, Ishmael is universally recognized as the patriarch and ancestor of the Arabs and, by spiritual extension, the Muslims.
Precisely.
The author uses Genesis to argue that the inheritance rightfully belongs to the Arabs and explicitly not to Isaac, the ancestor of the Jews, who did not even exist as a legal entity when the overarching covenant of the land was finalized.
That is an astonishingly aggressive reading of the text.
It's a massive legal loophole they're claiming to find.
They are essentially arguing that the younger brother is trying to claim a trust fund that was already legally signed over to the older brother before the younger was even born.
Yes, it is a direct refutation of the core Zionist claim, using the very scripture that forms the basis of Zionism.
But the author knows they have a vulnerability in this argument, right?
Oh, definitely.
They have to address the elephant in the room regarding Islamic scripture.
Yes.
Because there is a very famous, widely cited verse in the Quran where Moses, leading the Israelites out of Egypt, explicitly commands his people to enter the Holy Land.
He says, "O my people, enter the Holy Land which Allah has assigned to you."
Right. So the author must explain how a Quranic decree granting the land to the Israelites doesn't completely destroy their own argument. How do they navigate that? Because that sounds like a fairly explicit divine endorsement of the Israelite claim to the land, written right into the Quran.
They navigate it by introducing the theological concept of conditionality.
Conditional.
Yes. The author, leaning on centuries of Islamic exegesis and commentators, argues that this command by Moses was not an eternal, unconditional blank check decree for all of time.
It wasn't a permanent deed to the real estate.
Exactly. It was a highly specific, conditional reward contingent upon their faith, their obedience, and their willingness to establish God's law at that exact specific moment in history.
Ah, I see.
And to reinforce this reading, the author remarkably brings in a Western academic, Dr. Alfred Guillaume, a renowned professor of Old Testament studies at London University.
Using a Western scholar to validate an Islamic theological interpretation, what does Dr. Guillaume argue?
Dr. Guillaume is quoted as stating definitively that upon a close reading of the texts, there is absolutely no unconditional promise of an eternal possession of the land.
So it was always conditional.
The promises were always contingent upon the people keeping the covenant and obeying the commandments.
Conditionality is the key that unlocks the final argument.
It is.
The author builds to a closing, sweeping theological verdict. The earth does not belong to any specific bloodline. The earth belongs entirely to God, and he grants it as an inheritance to his righteous servants.
Right. It is not genetic real estate passed down through DNA. It is a divine stewardship granted strictly by faith and obedience.
And this is where the author brings the hammer down.
The argument concludes that because the ancient Israelites fundamentally broke the contract, because they rebelled against the prophets, worshipped foreign idols, and shed innocent blood.
Which the author painstakingly proved earlier by quoting their own prophets, Ezekiel and Jeremiah.
Exactly. Because of all that, the divine promise was legally and spiritually revoked.
The contract was breached, so the landlord evicted the tenant.
The covenant was broken beyond repair. And according to the logic of the text, because the land is inherited only by those who actually establish God's religion and hold true to the faith, the stewardship of the land rightfully passed to the Muslims.
Provided, of course, that they remain steadfast in their own belief and obedience.
Provided they keep their end of the bargain, yes.
We need to take a deep breath and synthesize the immense, overwhelming scope of what we just walked through.
It is a lot to take in.
Because what this author has attempted in this text is staggering in its ambition.
It truly is. The text we've spent the last hour dissecting does not merely offer a political or territorial disagreement with Zionism.
No, it attempts a total, scorched earth deconstruction of every single one of its foundational pillars.
Let's review the devastation left in the wake of this argument.
Let's do it.
The author attacked their fundamental character, labeling it inherently deceitful and fabricated, using the story of Abdullah bin Salam.
Right.
They attack their core theology, deploying al-Qurtubi to claim they aren't the chosen people, but rather a uniquely punished demographic.
Uh-huh.
They attack their race and genetics, using Eugene Pittard and the Khazar hypothesis to argue they aren't even Semitic, let alone descendants of the ancient Israelites.
And finally, they attack their history, using the chronological timeline of Genesis to award the biological inheritance to Ishmael, and utilizing the concept of conditionality to revoke the covenant entirely.
And it's the rhetorical methodology that makes this document so uniquely potent. The author uses Islamic theology to set the overarching frame and the moral high ground, but then meticulously uses a highly specific reading of Jewish history, Western anthropology, and biblical scripture to attack the opponent from the inside out.
It is a narrative siege.
It is.
So why does exploring this intense, uncompromising material matter for you, the listener? Why spend an hour diving into the mechanics of a text that is so deeply, unyieldingly polemical?
Because regardless of your personal views on the Middle East, regardless of where your political sympathies lie or what you believe about the history of the region, you absolutely cannot understand the true depth and the paralyzing intractability of this conflict without deeply understanding these specific counter-narratives.
It brings us right back to what we established at the very beginning of this deep dive. This conflict is not just a debate over borders drawn in 1948 or security checkpoints established in 1967.
No, it's not.
This is a debate over the fundamental nature of ancient history. It is a debate over the biological reality of human genetics. It is a debate over who rightfully owns the legacy of Abraham.
And ultimately, it's a debate over the mechanics of divine will.
Exactly. When the roots of a political conflict go down to the cellular level of DNA and reach all the way up to the throne of God, secular treaties and UN resolutions seem incredibly fragile.
Well, sounds naive.
Yeah.
Understanding the meticulous architecture of this specific counter-narrative reveals exactly why the rhetoric surrounding this conflict is so absolute, so devoid of gray areas.
Because when your baseline assumption, the very foundation of your worldview, is that your opponent's entire existence on a piece of land is based on a cosmic scriptural forgery and a massive genetic impersonation by a Turkic tribe.
There isn't much room for a two-state solution or political compromise. You cannot compromise with what you fundamentally believe is a fabrication.
Which brings us back to our opening metaphor, the shattered X-ray machine.
Right.
We started this journey looking for a clear diagnosis, a simple explanation for a complex problem. But what we found instead was a labyrinth of competing truths, where biology, theology, and history are weaponized against one another.
It's incredibly complex.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that really crystallizes the profound tragedy of this entire situation.
What stands out to you the most after unpacking all of this?
Think deeply about what we just discussed regarding Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and the book of Genesis.
Okay.
Consider the reality that these conflicting groups are both fiercely clutching the exact same ancient religious texts, pointing to the exact same characters to prove mutually exclusive divine rights to the exact same narrow strip of land.
It's a paradox.
When the text itself is the primary battleground, is it ever truly possible for historical or theological debate to actually resolve the conflict? Or does arguing over the interpretation of the same ancient words only guarantee that the conflict remains eternal?
It is a profound and unsettling question. When the shared history is the very weapon being used to inflict the wounds, peace would seem to require an entirely different vocabulary, one that neither side currently seems willing to speak.
It really does. It requires stepping outside the architecture we just spent an hour mapping. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It was a heavy, complex, but incredibly vital narrative to unpack. We will catch you next time as we continue to explore the hidden architectures and historical forces that shape our world. Take care.